All right, let's talk about something that never quite sits right when you really stop to look at it. Imperial cities. I mean, think about it. You hear City of the Imperium, and your mind probably flashes with images of towering cathedrals, Gothic spires reaching into smog-choked skies, endless hives stretching across continents, and monuments to a god-emperor who's been dead for 10,000 years. It's grand, it's brutal, it's awe-inspiring. But then you zoom in. What do you see? Cracks in the ferrocrete, bridges half collapsed, millions living in shanties built atop older ruins, which themselves were built atop even older ruins. Whole sectors without light, without water, without hope. And somehow, nobody seems surprised, not even the people who live there. Because here's the thing, this isn't accidental. It's not a side effect of war or time or poor logistics. No, the decay of imperial cities is by design. It's theology carved into stone. It's philosophy written in rust. The Imperium doesn't just tolerate collapse, it reveres it. Cities aren't meant to grow in the Imperium. They're meant to rot, to crumble, to crush those beneath them into submission. And that's not a bug in the system, it is the system. So today we're going to pick apart this madness. We're going to ask why these places are built to fail, why beauty is buried under grime, and why suffering is baked into every block of stone. We'll trace the ideology behind urban decay, peel back the dogma that celebrates destruction, and try to understand what it really means to live and die in the ruins of humanity's greatest empire. Because if there's one truth the Imperium teaches over and over again, it's this. Decay is not the end. It's the point. You ever really looked at an Imperial city from afar? Not just glanced, but stood there, letting your eyes trace the lines of its structure, the way every wall leans like it's ready to collapse. Every tower seems to shudder under its own weight, and the whole place feels like it was frozen mid-siege. That's no accident. Imperial cities are built like fortresses under permanent assault, as if the architects were expecting the sky itself to fall. And honestly, maybe they were. There's this idea that runs deep in the Imperium's bones, the notion that life is war, not metaphorical war, actual war, endless, grinding, soul-crushing war. So if life is war, then your home, your city, your entire world should reflect that. That's why these cities look like they've been shelled into oblivion before they were even finished. It's not decay after the fact. It's designed decay. This isn't just brutalism or Gothic flair. It's a coded message in stone. You are never safe. You are always under siege. You were born into suffering, and you'll die in it too. And that's righteous. There's a kind of awe to it, honestly. The scale is overwhelming. You see a cathedral the size of a mountain, half of it covered in scaffolding for centuries, the other half already falling apart, and it still works. It's still used. No one ever talks about finishing anything, just reinforcing the bits that haven't collapsed yet. There's beauty in it, but it's not the kind that comforts. It's beauty that intimidates, that dominates, that reminds you every single day that you are nothing compared to the God Emperor's vision. And it's not just about size or intimidation. There's theater in the decay. You walk through a hive's underbelly and the cracks in the walls seem to whisper prayers. The rusted aqueducts groan like dying saints. There are whole sections of city that are entirely ceremonial in their ruin, built to look like they've withstood 1,000 sieges, even if they never saw a single battle. Because the appearance of resistance is just as sacred as the act itself. A city that looks bombed out becomes a shrine to endurance. A facade of collapse becomes a canvas for martyrdom. Fan theories go deep here. Some say the Departamento Munitorum has standardized holy deterioration ratios, literal architectural ratios to ensure the right amount of brokenness per structure. Others think it's the ecclesiarchy pulling the strings, demanding buildings be constructed with deliberate imperfections to reflect the spiritual imperfection of man. There are stories of tech priests deliberately using unstable materials, mixing sacred ash into the mortar, or placing reliquary shards where the supports should go. a kind of spiritual sabotage, so the buildings themselves become acts of devotion. And you see it in the design language too. Windows aren't shaped for light. They're shaped like crosses, skulls, or screaming saints. Stairways lead nowhere, collapsing into voids. Archways are too narrow for tanks, but too wide for people. Everything is oversized or undersized, never meant for comfort, only for ritual and restriction. Every element says, you are small, you are under judgment. This is not your city, it's his. Even the layout of these cities plays into it. They're confusing, almost intentionally so. Streets spiral into dead ends, districts overlap like scars, and maps are considered contraband in some places. Because knowing where you are, that's a luxury. And the Imperium doesn't do luxury. It does hardship, confusion, obedience. If you're lost, that's a reminder. You're not meant to navigate. You're meant to submit. There's something almost masochistic about it. The people who live in these cities, most of them never question it. They grow up in it. They breathe the dust. They worship in the same broken shrines their ancestors did. Some even take pride in the decay, as if the rot itself proves their faith. You hear pilgrims say things like, only through ruin can the soul be cleansed. And when a hab block collapses and kills hundreds, it's not seen as a tragedy. It's a divine test, a sacrifice, an offering of flesh to stone. But to outsiders, those rare few who've walked through cities untouched by the Imperium, it's horrifying. The contrast is unbearable. Places that were once clean, efficient, almost sterile, now reduced to jagged silhouettes against blood-red skies. And yet, within the Imperium, this destruction is canonized. Cities are not monuments to progress. They're warnings. They're scars left open on purpose to remind everyone what happens when faith wavers, when vigilance slips. I remember a fan theory I read once that really stuck with me. It said that every Imperial city is modeled after a battlefield in the Emperor's Great Crusade, like an echo, that the shattered arches and half-built towers are recreations of the places where Primarchs bled and worlds were burned clean. If that's true, then these cities aren't just homes, they're reenactments. A kind of permanent war memorial lived in by the descendants of the defeated. And maybe that's the whole point. Maybe Imperial cities are built to look like they're always crumbling, always dying, because the Imperium needs them to be. It needs you to live in fear, to look up at broken towers and feel awe instead of anger, to accept rot as righteous, suffering as sacred. Because if the cities were whole, if they were beautiful, clean, alive, then maybe people would start to believe they deserve something better. And that would be heresy. Here's the truth a lot of people miss when they try to make sense of the Imperium's filth and collapse. It's not just architectural or logistical, it's deeply, violently theological. The decay is doctrine, the rot is holy, and the people living inside these broken cities, they're not just subjects of the Imperium. They're instruments of its worship, kneeling every day before gods of rust, ruin, and silence. In the Imperium of man, faith isn't about salvation. It's about enduring damnation and calling it divine. The Imperium's entire religious structure is built on the bones of collapse. The God Emperor himself is a corpse sustained by pain and prayer, immobile on his throne while trillions scream his name into the void. That isn't an accident. It's the symbol of a greater truth, that to suffer is to serve. And that core idea infects every level of society, right down to the streets and the stone beneath your feet. Cities fall apart, not because they were forgotten, but because they remind you that decay is the proper state of things. Because in the Imperium, order without pain is suspicious. Comfort is weakness. A stable, clean environment is a lie. Only through endless collapse can one prove their loyalty. It's hard to overstate just how deeply embedded this mindset is. Think about the stories they tell children. Tales of saints burned alive, planets purged in holy fire, martyrs who smiled as their flesh was flayed. Not one of them gets a happy ending. That's not the point. The point is the suffering. The point is the endurance. That's what makes them holy. So when an entire city block collapses and kills thousands, it's not just a civic failure, it's a reenactment of those stories. A retelling. Another chapter in the gospel of human agony. Some fan interpretations go even darker. There's this idea that the ecclesiarchy doesn't just accept collapse, it orchestrates it. That priests might call down ruin on their own congregations to provoke acts of penance and public mourning. That decay is seeded into city design like a slow-burning sermon. That every leaking pipe and shattered wall is another verse in a hymn of suffering. It sounds insane, but in the context of the Imperium, it makes a twisted kind of sense. After all, how better to prove your devotion than to pray while buried under rubble? And then there's the redemption cults. You want to see theology weaponized into self-destruction? Look no further. These zealots want the cities to fall. They believe that humanity must be purified by fire, stone, and starvation. That the collapse of a city is the birth of sanctity. So they burn down sectors, tear up roads, and call it holy work. And the scariest part, sometimes the Adeptus Ministorum turns a blind eye, because while these cults are heretical by definition, they also do the one thing the ecclesiarchy values most. They keep people afraid, obedient, and on their knees. Even the High Lords of Terra, in all their decaying splendor, embody this ideology. They don't rule from gleaming palaces. They squat atop collapsing bureaucracies, entire districts drowning in paperwork and decay. They don't fix things. They let them break more slowly, because fixing implies control, and control implies hope. But the Imperium doesn't run on hope. It runs on inevitability, on the certainty that everything will get worse, and that's how you know you're doing it right. The idea of spokutia, atonement, is central here, not just for individual sins, but for the collective sin of being human. Humanity, in the eyes of the ecclesiarchy, is a race of sinners kept alive only by divine punishment. The galaxy is a test, and cities are the crucibles. When a city falls apart, it's not a tragedy, it's a necessary refinement, a slow, grinding sanctification of millions. People don't live in cities, they burn in them, like incense on a holy altar. And maybe the most disturbing part, the people believe it. Not all of them, of course, but enough. Enough that when their child dies of starvation in a collapsed hab unit, they don't curse the system. They thank the Emperor for the chance to suffer in his name. Enough that when they wake up choking on chem fog and ash, they don't ask for cleaner air. They ask for stronger lungs, to endure more, to be worthy. It's not just faith. It's internalized trauma, weaponized over millennia into a form of worship. You see this in their language, too. Words like blessing and purification are used to describe natural disasters. A building that collapses overnight is said to have achieved sanctity. A bridge that kills hundreds is called an act of divine culling. You even have scribes who catalog every structural failure as part of a city's spiritual biography. Like each ruin has a soul, and every new crack brings it closer to holiness. That's what I mean when I say this is more than just theology. It's an ideology of entropy, a worldview where collapse isn't feared, it's longed for. Because in the Imperium's heart, to crumble is to be close to the Emperor, not in the sense of reward, but in imitation. After all, the Emperor is the most broken thing in existence, and he is still worshipped. So what better proof of your devotion than to become broken yourself? There's a theory I came across once that stuck with me. It said that the Imperium doesn't actually believe in progress at all, that every policy, every prayer, every city plan is just a different method of delaying the inevitable. Because in the theology of urban decay, the goal isn't to thrive, it's to endure, to hang on just long enough for someone to notice, or not. Either way, it's all part of the script. And the worst part? That script keeps getting longer. There's this moment that hits you the first time you really try to make sense of how an imperial city functions, or rather, how it doesn't. You might be looking at a map scrawled on the back of a ration ticket, or talking to a local scribe who's lived in the same slum sector for 40 years, and it just dawns on you. This place isn't broken by mistake, it's broken by procedure. Cities in the Imperium don't fall into ruin because nobody cares. They fall because too many people care in the wrong way, and none of them are allowed to change anything. It's a labyrinth of overlapping authority, contradictory decrees, and self-sabotaging obedience. It's not just decay. It's decay with a filing cabinet. Imperial bureaucracy is legendary, and not in a good way. Every single sector, every block, sometimes even individual stairwells, are under the jurisdiction of different departments. The Departamento Munitorum might control one half of a manufactorum, while the Adeptus Administratum oversees the other. Then you've got local enforcers who technically answer to both, but in reality serve the Arbites, who themselves may or may not take orders from the planetary governor, who answers to the High Lords, who only intervene when it's already too late. It's a Gordian knot of red tape that tightens every year and never, ever comes undone. So what happens when a bridge collapses? Well, first someone has to report it. That alone can take weeks, because most citizens don't even know where to file complaints. Or if they do, the offices are in another district that hasn't had functioning transit in years. Assuming it gets reported, the request has to be translated into High Gothic, stamped with purity seals, logged in triplicate, and routed through 3 layers of approval, each of which may reject it for different reasons. The Departamento Munitorum might say the materials are reserved for military fortifications. The local shrine might claim the collapse was divine will. The Adeptus Mechanicus might refuse to send tech priests because the bridge was originally constructed using pre-imperial schematics they consider heretical. By the time a repair crew is even theoretically dispatched, it's been years. The bridge is already buried under rubble, scavenged for scrap, or replaced by a makeshift ropeway the locals built themselves. And even then, there's no guarantee it'll be repaired, because often, once something breaks in the Imperium, it gets reassigned to the Historical Archive category, which literally means do not fix, sacred ruin. You think I'm kidding, but I once read a fan interpretation that claimed entire sectors are designated as devotional collapse zones, areas meant to symbolize mankind's fall from grace and therefore left untouched. The thing is, even when resources are available, they rarely get where they're needed. Supplies are hoarded, misallocated, or lost in transit. There are stories of whole convoys filled with construction materials wandering the same dozen streets for decades because their original delivery coordinates were overwritten by a cogitator glitch, and no one's authorized to reroute them. Some fans call this the infinite loop of labor, a phenomenon where work orders circle eternally through the system unfulfilled while people starve in the shadows of empty cranes. And the people managing all this? Most of them aren't malicious. They're cogs in a machine too big to understand, too slow to stop. Administrative scribes with half-functioning augmetics, clerks who've never left their data vaults in 40 years, servitors who sign off on death tolls like they're balancing ledgers. You hear stories of entire generations of bureaucrats working on a single document, passing it down like a sacred relic. By the time the last stamp is placed, the original issue doesn't even exist anymore. Maybe the building's gone. Maybe the city is. Doesn't matter. The paperwork is perfect. And the absurdity of it all only deepens when you look at how cities are allowed to grow, or rather, how they're not. Building something new requires more permissions than tearing something down. There are forms for form requests, Vox channels reserved for authorization codes that haven't been used in centuries. Even the Mechanicus prefers patching ancient machines over innovation. It's safer, more orthodox. Newness is dangerous. Change is suspicious. So cities don't evolve, they accumulate. Layers upon layers of failure, dust, bone, and bureaucracy, stacked until they blot out the sun. It's no wonder entire districts go dark for decades, forgotten by everyone but their own inhabitants. When someone finally notices, it's often a fluke. A tech adept notices an anomaly on a data feed, or a minor noble's child goes missing during a pilgrimage. And then, even after rediscovery, nothing happens. Because the moment someone tries to intervene, They trigger territorial disputes between factions that haven't spoken since the Great Crusade. An emperor forbid anyone tries to bypass the chain of command. That's not initiative in the Imperium. That's heresy. Fans often compare the Imperium's cities to a kind of cancerous growth. Not in the sense of something evil, but something blind. Cities just keep expanding outward and upward, devouring themselves, forgetting their origins. Entire levels are sealed off because no one knows what's down there anymore, or worse, because someone does. Ancient wars fought in the bowels of hive worlds, their records erased or buried in forbidden archives, have left scars no one is allowed to treat. So instead of rebuilding, new layers are added, a new floor over the blood-stained one, a new shrine over the ruins of the old. And through all this, the most terrifying thing is that people adapt. They build homes in broken manufactorums, markets in the hollow husks of hab towers, schools in collapsed basilicas. Life finds a way, but it's a mutated, exhausted kind of life. You learn not to expect repairs. You learn to pray for stability, not comfort. You raise your children in the shadow of ruins and teach them that order is chaos with a better uniform. This isn't neglect. This is systemic theology. The decay is codified. The breakdown is policy. Because the Imperium doesn't need its cities to function, it just needs them to persist. To exist long enough for another generation to be born, to suffer, and to die in the name of something they'll never see. That's the Imperium. That's the machine. And the cities? They're just its symptoms. There's a moment that sticks with you the first time you see a building collapse in the Imperium, and not because of the destruction itself, but because of how the people react. You'd expect panic, screaming, maybe desperation. And sure, you'll get that. But what you also get, what hits even harder, is the reverence, the bowed heads, the whispered prayers, the way a mother cradling her injured child still has the presence of mind to cross herself in the sign of the Aquila as ash rains down. It's not just seen as loss, it's seen as revelation, as if the building didn't fall by accident, but because the Emperor wanted it to. In the Imperium, ruin isn't just tolerated, it's venerated. When a spire collapses or a shrine crumbles, it's often taken as a divine message. Not a warning, not a punishment, but a blessing, a cleansing. A sign that the structure has fulfilled its purpose and is now returning to the dust from which it came. Dust that is, of course, sanctified by the mere fact that it once held walls. You'll even see pilgrims come to these sites after the fact, scraping flakes of paint from shattered icons, gathering rubble into reliquaries. They call it devotional debris. It's like relic hunting, except the miracle is in the collapse itself. Some claim that buildings in the Imperium don't have souls, but they do have fates. That every structure, just like every human, is born impure and must be broken to become spiritually whole. The act of falling, the cracking of stone, the collapse of steel, it's seen by some as a building's final prayer, its last act of loyalty. And if people die in the process, all the better. Because in the warped theology of the Imperium, death by holy ruin is an express ticket to martyrdom. It's almost aspirational. There are entire cults dedicated to this, not fringe sects either. Actual ecclesiarchy-endorsed orders that track structural failure rates as if they were signs from the stars. One group, the Canticle of Collapse, believes that entropy is the Emperor's true voice. That when a roof gives out or a wall buckles, it's not a mistake. It's him, speaking through time and pressure. They wander the cities looking for crumbling districts, living in them until they finally give way. Then they move on, heads bloodied, spirits exalted. There's also this widespread belief that collapse purifies sin, not metaphorically, literally. If a shrine is struck by a meteor or destroyed in a quake, the event is not mourned. It's celebrated, because now the site has passed through divine fire. It has been tested, refined, made worthy. There are sermons carved into the walls of such ruins, praising them for having endured divine judgment. Some preachers even claim that the Emperor tests his people not through success, but through collapse. That a building that still stands might be too proud, and that only through falling can it know humility. And the stories. Emperor, help me. The stories. You'll hear tales passed down through generations about the day the chapel roof fell in, crushing a congregation mid-liturgy, and how not a single soul screamed. They all just looked up, accepted it, and were entombed in silent prayer. The place is now considered hallowed ground. People sneak in to touch the dust, to feel what they call proximity to grace, as if death under ruin makes you closer to divinity, as if the stones themselves remember the names of the dead. It's not hard to see how this kind of thinking takes root. In a galaxy where hope is manufactured and faith is weaponized, where the god you pray to is a withered corpse held together by psychic agony, the idea that ruin is holy starts to make a terrifying kind of sense. You can't fix everything. You can't stop the decay, so you sanctify it. You wrap it in scripture. You build rituals around it until the very notion of repair feels sacrilegious, until maintenance becomes heresy and letting go becomes worship. There's even official liturgy to support this. The Litany of Stone's final purpose is recited during building collapses, especially if the structure is particularly ancient or religious. The chant praises the Emperor for allowing the edifice to stand for as long as it did, then thanks him for granting it the honor of collapse. It ends with the line, "And may its dust sing hymns as it falls." That's not just poetry, that's a worldview. That's how deep the sacralization of ruin runs. And it's not limited to religious buildings. Hab blocks, manufactorums, even old Mechanicus enclaves. They're all seen as potentially sanctified by collapse. I read a fan theory once that claimed some cities actually have target collapse quotas, goals for how many structures must fall each decade to maintain spiritual equilibrium. It sounds absurd until you remember how the Imperium thinks. Ritual trumps reason, sacrifice over stability. So if a crumbling dome inspires more prayer than a stable one, then let it fall. What's most haunting, though, is how normal it all feels to those inside. You see a group of kids playing near a fractured column, and one of them casually says something like, "That'll be gone next winter, Emperor willing." Not with fear, not with bitterness, with hope. Because maybe when it falls, the suffering will mean something. Maybe it'll cleanse the district. Maybe it'll draw attention from the Arbites, the Mechanicus, or the Ministorum, someone who'll finally see them. Not help, of course, just notice. This is what happens when a society has internalized collapse not as failure, but as fate. When the very idea of endurance is redefined to mean graceful submission to destruction. And maybe that's the saddest part of all, that in a galaxy full of enemies, it's not the Xenos or the heretics that do the most damage. It's the buildings, the falling stones, the sacred dust. Because in the Imperium, when something breaks, they don't ask how to fix it. They ask how to praise it. Here's something I didn't really grasp until I started looking at the Imperium's cities, not just as places people live, but as tools. Because that's what they are, gigantic, crumbling, smoke-choked tools of propaganda. They don't just house citizens, they teach them, not with words, but with ruin, with dust, with the constant unspoken message. This is what loyalty looks like. This is what you must endure. And if you ever forget your place, just look around. The Imperium doesn't build cities to inspire hope. It builds them to instill obedience. And it's not subtle. When you walk through a district that hasn't seen sunlight in centuries, where every wall bears devotional scarring and every building leans like it's mid-collapse, you don't start dreaming of rebellion. You start trying to survive. You think less, you hope less, you become smaller. That's the point. Architecture as an instrument of control, and it works, not because it lies, but because it tells the truth too loudly. The truth that the Emperor demands suffering, that survival is grace, that you're lucky to be part of the machine at all, even if you're choking on ash and praying your ceiling doesn't fall in tonight. And this isn't some accidental byproduct of poor planning. This is orchestrated, engineered, a kind of weaponized despair. Entire sectors are deliberately left to decay because their very appearance crushes morale in the right way. Not the rebellious, angry way, but the quiet, soul-numbing, spiritually broken kind of way. And that emotional flattening, that's gold to the people in power. A city that bleeds makes citizens easier to rule. They don't rise up, they kneel down harder. There's this brilliant piece of fan commentary I once read that framed the Imperium's urban decay as a form of visual indoctrination. The theory was that every collapsing stairwell, every soot-covered chapel, every drowned sump floor was like a sermon, just one you walk through instead of hearing. It said that you're not supposed to feel pride when you look at your city. You're supposed to feel shame, or awe, or guilt. That the very streets beneath your boots are meant to remind you that you are temporary, disposable, and part of something far larger and far more important than yourself. And that kind of thinking makes for perfect Imperial citizens. Now imagine how this looks from the outside. Let's say you're an agent of some Xenos faction, or worse, a traitor from within, trying to understand the Imperium. You step into one of their cities expecting dysfunction, weakness, an easy target. But instead, you find people who worship their own degradation, who treat bombed-out temples as relics, who weep when their neighbors are crushed by falling hab blocks and call it a gift. It's not just confusing, it's terrifying. Because how do you fight someone who doesn't want comfort, doesn't care about survival, and thinks dying under a collapsing wall is divine? That's where the propaganda comes in full force. Decay becomes a language of strength. Neglect becomes proof of spiritual commitment. You'll see murals of saints with broken spines, cathedrals that are more scaffolding than stone, statues missing limbs and faces. And they're celebrated that way. You don't fix the statue. You paint around the damage. You incorporate it. Because the wound is the message. The ecclesiarchy leans into this hard. They issue sermons that praise entire cities for their decay. You'll hear phrases like the blessed rot of redemption, or walls soaked in the tears of martyrs. I once heard of a planetary governor who deliberately had parts of his palace sabotaged, pipes burst, ceilings cracked, so visiting pilgrims would see his home as a monument of shared suffering. And it worked. His popularity with the faithful skyrocketed. Because in the Imperium, a pristine building isn't impressive, it's suspicious. If you aren't bleeding, you're probably hiding something. This form of visual storytelling extends to martyrdom too. If someone dies tragically, especially in a structural collapse or urban disaster, their image will often be carved directly into the broken walls. A child killed by a falling statue might become part of the new statue, her face frozen in stone beside the one that killed her, both now holy. It's morbid, sure. But it sends a message. Death in service is beautiful. Death by neglect is still devotion. And death beneath rubble is the closest thing to sainthood most people will ever know. There are even rumors, half facts really, about cities being staged for outside observers. When the Inquisition visits, or when the Arbites want to showcase Imperial zeal, entire districts might be made worse on purpose. Rubble is redistributed to appear more dramatic. Smoke is pumped into the air. Corpses are arranged with candles and devotional tokens. Not because they want to hide the decay, but because they want it seen. They want the visiting eyes to feel the weight of the Imperium's suffering, and they want them to be afraid of how willingly it's embraced. It's not hard to see how this becomes internalized. Kids grow up playing in rust and bloodstains. Their lullabies are hymns about falling towers and martyrdom through starvation. Their schools are cracked bunkers where lessons are taught over the groans of stressed steel beams. By the time they're adults, the decay isn't just around them, it's in them. It's the lens they see the world through. They don't expect safety, they expect collapse, and they've been taught to love it. All of this serves one goal: control. Control through humility, through awe, through despair. Cities don't just house people, they condition them. Turn them into believers who flinch at cleanliness, who distrust repair, who praise the Emperor for every new crack in the ceiling. And when something finally does collapse and people are buried, the survivors don't protest. They kneel. They thank him for the chance to witness holy ruin. That's the real horror of the Imperium's cities. Not the rot, not the blood, but the fact that it's meant to be like this, that someone, somewhere, decided long ago that the best way to hold an empire together was with cities that look like dying animals, too broken to rebel, too sacred to fix, and too afraid to even imagine anything else. One of the first things you notice when you look at an Imperial city's skyline is how nothing ever really starts. There are half-finished towers wrapped in scaffold that's older than most of the population, broken roads patched with whatever scrap was nearby, ducts leaking promethium that someone just stuffed rags into and painted with a purity seal. It's like the cities themselves are caught in a time loop, always mid-repair, never actually repaired. And once you understand how the Imperium views war, it all starts to make sense. See, the Imperium doesn't believe in peace. Not really. Peace is considered a lull in enemy activity, not a status in its own right. The galaxy is at war. Always has been. Always will be. And every citizen, every block of stone, every nail and bolt is part of that war effort. Cities aren't designed to thrive. They're designed to hold, to endure siege, bombardment, Xenos incursions, uprisings, orbital strikes, forever. And when something breaks, it's not a call for progress. It's a call for triage. New construction? That's a luxury, a dangerous one even. Building something new implies the war isn't immediate, that there's room to breathe, that hope exists. And hope is dangerous in the Imperium. It makes people ask questions. It opens doors. So instead, everything is patched, welded, reinforced. There's a reason repair crews carry more devotional charms than tools, because even fixing things is framed as an act of faith, not improvement. There's a rhythm to it, a sort of sacred stagnation. Something breaks, it gets just enough attention to keep functioning, and then everyone moves on. Entire teams of laborers will spend years fixing a single wall because they're forbidden from altering the original design, which hasn't been updated in over a millennium. You get whole squads of Adeptus Mechanicus acolytes poring over ancient schematics on stained parchment, terrified to deviate even slightly, because deviation might be innovation, and innovation might be heresy. And it's not like the need for repair is rare. These cities are under siege even when they're not. Environmental decay, tectonic instability, overpopulation, unchecked industry, and latent psychic fallout all act as constant background threats. Add in the occasional actual invasion, Tyranids, orcs, chaos cults, and you've got a landscape that's never not breaking. But instead of wiping the slate clean, instead of bulldozing the ruins and starting fresh, the Imperium just keeps layering. Old walls reinforced with bones and scrap. Collapsed buildings repurposed into foundations for new shanties. It's like watching a corpse dressed in more and more armor, hoping it can still march. There's this fan theory I really like. It says that Imperial cities are never really planned in the first place. They're reacted to. That their growth is more like geological strata than architecture. Something collapses? That becomes the basement for whatever's stacked on top. A road floods? Build a walkway over it. That walkway collapses? Rope bridges. That collapses? Use the rubble as barricades. Nothing is ever removed. Nothing is truly replaced. The past isn't buried. It's stood on. And this approach isn't just cultural. It's strategic. The Imperium wants its cities to be adaptable in this way. Not flexible, not efficient, but survivable. Think of it like this. If you build a sleek, modern structure, one direct hit takes it out. But if you live in a multi-layered hive of tangled ruins, collapsing shanties, and redundant support beams from 6 different centuries, it's much harder to destroy completely. The chaos becomes a kind of armor, a weird, self-replicating defense system that no enemy can ever fully comprehend, let alone neutralize. It also serves as a kind of camouflage. An Imperial city looks just as wrecked before a battle as it does after one. So enemies can't tell what they've damaged, and citizens don't notice the difference either. I read this account once where a Chaos warband bombarded a city for 3 days, only to realize their target had already been abandoned decades earlier. It just looked occupied because of the number of devotional fires still burning, kept alive by servitors running on looped prayers. The decay was so complete it fooled both sides. The culture of eternal repair bleeds into the people too. You'll find artisans who specialize in patching rather than creating. Plumbers who don't fix pipes, they just redirect the leaks to where it won't flood holy ground. Electricians who don't restore power, they just reroute it through devotional statues. Everyone becomes an expert in improvisation, not in crafting solutions, but in preserving failures. And no one questions it. Why would they? If your whole life has been spent praying under a leaking ceiling, you don't wish for a new roof. You just pray it collapses on you during Mass so your death will mean something. That's the level of psychological saturation we're talking about, where constant slow collapse is just part of the background hum of reality, like static, like incense smoke, like chanting. Some say this all traces back to the Great Crusade, that back then cities were built with purpose, symmetry, function. But once the Horus heresy shattered the dream of progress, the Imperium switched tactics. It stopped building toward the future and started entrenching itself in the present. Because the future was uncertain. The present was war. And you don't build cathedrals to hope when the sky is always burning. You build bunkers made of prayers and rust. The result is a civilization that never quite lives anywhere. It just holds out. Cities aren't habitats. They're redoubts, bastions. And the longer a city can cling to some form of life, the more holy it becomes. You'll find places that haven't had power in generations, but are still considered active, simply because a handful of scribes are still alive and writing by candlelight. That counts as occupation. That counts as survival. It's poetic in a way, but it's also tragic, because nothing gets better. Things just stay broken in new ways. People grow old fixing the same pipes their fathers did. Kids play in rubble their grandparents bled in, and through it all, the cities stand. Not proudly, not defiantly, but stubbornly. Cracked, smoking, patched 1,000 times, but still there. Because in the Imperium, survival isn't about thriving. It's about not collapsing faster than expected. And that's enough to be called victory. There's this quiet, dreadful beauty in how every Imperial structure seems to suffer. You can see it in the leaning spires, in the groaning buttresses, in the rivets strained to their limit. These buildings look tired, like they've been awake for 10,000 years, holding in pain, unable to rest. And that's exactly what makes them sacred. In the Imperium, architecture doesn't just shelter bodies, it preaches submission. Every crack, every creaking girder, every sagging arch is a sermon about pain. Not as punishment, but as purpose. Because this is a culture built around a god who no longer moves, who no longer speaks, only suffers. The god emperor sits unmoving, unmending, on a throne of agony, and his empire mirrors him in every way. His cities hurt, his shrines bleed rust, his walls collapse under their own weight because pain is the shape of loyalty. The Imperium doesn't just revere strength, it reveres endurance. And nothing endures like a building that should have fallen centuries ago but hasn't, simply because it wasn't allowed to. You'll see monuments with chains bolted into them, not decorative ones, but real, weight-bearing chains. Towers that groan like wounded animals under the stress of their own symbolic burden. Windows shaped like weeping eyes. Doors so narrow they force people to squeeze through sideways, bowing their heads in subconscious submission. All of it is intentional. Every step through an Imperial city is meant to remind you of your weakness, your burden, your duty. Some say the cities are built to break the body before the soul even has the chance to rebel. Stairs that spiral endlessly, elevators that haven't worked in living memory, walkways exposed to acid rains. It's not just inconvenient, it's catechism. The suffering imposed by these environments is what binds the citizen to the God Emperor. When you bruise your knees crawling through the entrance of a cathedral because it's built too low to walk into, that's not poor design, it's piety in stone. And the thing is, people embrace it. You'll meet pilgrims who deliberately seek out the most damaged structures to pray in, believing that the more ruined the surroundings, the more receptive the Emperor is to their prayers. They kneel in sewage. They light candles in broken sewer drains. They chant beneath girders that could fall at any moment and call it communion. One popular saying among hive world penitents is, "The stone suffers with us." And they mean it. There's a particular kind of architecture you find in martyr districts, places where saints died or where entire populations were cleansed in purges. The structures there are left purposefully shattered, walls scorched by flamers, vaults cracked open like skulls, not cleaned, not repaired, left to rot in reverence. And somehow, that damage becomes more sacred than the buildings ever were when whole. It's like the stone was baptized in suffering, like it got closer to the Emperor through ruin than it ever could through ritual. I read a fan theory once that suggested buildings in the Imperium are designed with internal strain built into their blueprints, literal structural stress engineered to cause slow, controlled deformation over centuries. Why? So that the faithful can watch the burden increase, so that generations of citizens can grow up seeing their city buckle and bend and learn, instinctively, that pain is eternal, that it grows, that it must be carried. It's absurd, and yet completely believable. You see this obsession with pain reflected in the material choices too. Stone that's intentionally rough, so your hands bleed if you touch the walls. Floors designed to shift under pressure, forcing the body to tense constantly. Even the benches in some shrines are shaped to dig into the spine if you sit too long. It's not just about mortification. It's about making sure that every moment, even in rest, reflects the hardship that defines the Imperium. And this goes beyond buildings. Cities themselves are sculpted as if they're suffering. You'll find entire districts built into canyons of shadow, never touched by light, because their placement reinforces the theme of spiritual darkness. Bridges that go nowhere, just to symbolize lost purpose. Statues of saints screaming in agony instead of triumph. It's not art, it's dogma. Pain becomes a language, an architectural dialect, the grammar of sacrifice. There are stories, half historical, half holy, about architects who would fast for weeks before designing major structures, believing that hunger and deprivation would guide their hand to more sacred forms. Others would sleep in graveyards, trying to commune with decay, so their buildings could better reflect mankind's mortal curse. And the craziest part? Some of those buildings are still standing, and people swear they can feel the sorrow in the stone, that they dream of suffering when they sleep nearby. None of this is accidental. The Imperium doesn't accidentally design for torment. It doesn't stumble into horror. It cultivates it, celebrates it, packages it in sacred seals and liturgical chants. Because if the buildings suffer, then the people who live in them are reminded every day that they're part of something sacred, that their bruises are holy, that their hunger is a hymn, that even their death, especially their death, can mean something. And maybe that's the ultimate horror of it all, that people find peace in that suffering, that they come to love the cracks, the rust, the razor edges of their own homes, not because they're deluded, not because they don't see the pain, but because they've been told since birth that the only path to grace is through agony, that to live in comfort is to stray, and that the Emperor's light shines brightest on the broken. So the cities remain shattered, not because no one can fix them, but because fixing them would be a betrayal. Because somewhere deep down, the Imperium believes that if a wall doesn't bleed, it can't be faithful. There's something deeply unsettling about walking through an Imperial city and realizing that the only structures that seem alive, the only ones that look like someone actually cares, are the ones built to glorify pain, death, and divinity. You pass shattered hab blocks, rusted-out manufactorums, and streets so broken they've been reduced to footpaths through rubble. But then you turn a corner, and suddenly there's a cathedral towering above it all, its spires newly gilded, its statues scrubbed clean, its stained glass windows somehow intact in a world made of ash and ruin. It's like stepping into a dream or a warning. Religious structures in the Imperium don't just survive the decay. They stand above it, literally and figuratively. They're often the tallest buildings in the city, casting long shadows over entire districts, as if to remind everyone where their priorities should lie. And you better believe that's deliberate. These are not just places of worship. They are anchors of ideological control. They are temples not just to the Emperor, but to the very concept of obedience, hierarchy, and martyrdom. And unlike everything else in the city, they are maintained, they are repaired, they are even expanded, while families starve in the basements of crumbling towers next door. It's a common pattern. You see a district where a shrine was bombed during some long-forgotten war, and instead of letting it rot like the rest of the city, they rebuild it, lavishly, with imported marble, blessed steel, and relics dug up from battlefields half a sector away. Meanwhile, the adjacent housing complex is nothing but skeletal ferrocrete and collapsed walkways. It's not about utility, it's about presence. The Imperium needs these buildings to loom, to dominate, to remind everyone that suffering in the shadow of sanctity is the natural order of things, and people accept it. That's the truly wild part. You'd think there would be resentment, watching resources poured into rebuilding a basilica while children sleep in rain-soaked alleyways, but there isn't. Not really, because those buildings represent something untouchable. They are proof that the Emperor still watches, that he still receives. And if that means the rest of the city must fall deeper into rot to preserve his house, so be it. Some fan interpretations go even further, suggesting that religious buildings in the Imperium actually absorb the faith of the masses. That the more suffering surrounds them, the more powerful they become, like black holes of belief, pulling in misery and radiating control. It's a metaphor, sure, but it feels true when you're standing in front of a cathedral built on the bones of 10,000 martyrs, lit with candles fueled by recycled body fat, while acolytes chant prayers that have no beginning and no end. And then there's the symbolism in the architecture itself. Monasteries are often built on the highest points of a hive, as if they're physically closer to the Emperor. The climb to reach them is brutal, sometimes involving thousands of steps, exposed bridges, even labyrinthine tunnels guarded by scriptural automatons. It's not just about making the buildings impressive, it's about making you suffer to reach them. Because in the Imperium, proximity to holiness must be earned, usually with blood, time, and exhaustion. I once read about a shrine constructed at the base of a collapsed plasma vent. The heat never fully died down. To worship there meant risking burns, blisters, and even death. And yet it thrived. Pilgrims lined up in the smoke-choked streets, waiting their turn to crawl inside, convinced that if they could just endure the pain, the Emperor might hear them. And when some of them died, their bones were kept, displayed, honored, added to the sanctum as evidence of the shrine's power. This is the contrast that defines imperial cities. The closer you get to faith, the more solid the world becomes. Roads are cleaner around monasteries. Power is more stable. Guards are actually present, not because the Ministorum wants to improve life, but because they need these buildings to function perfectly. They are symbols. If they fall, so does everything else, so they become sanctuaries of repair in a sea of deliberate neglect. Not havens of mercy, but monuments of dominance. And it's not just the buildings themselves. Entire districts are restructured around these places of worship. Hab blocks are oriented to face shrines. Transit routes are redirected to prioritize access to cathedrals. Even sewage systems are modified so that the waste of the faithful doesn't pass beneath holy ground. And while the rest of the city drowns in its own rot, the sacred districts remain preserved like organs in gold-leaf sarcophagi. Some see it as hope, that maybe if the city can keep even one place whole, then all is not lost. That these buildings are beacons in the dark, reminders of something greater. But others, and I count myself among them, see something more cynical. These places aren't kept clean because they offer salvation. They're kept clean because they control the narrative. Because as long as those spires shine, people will believe that their suffering matters, that it leads somewhere, that it has purpose. And once you believe your pain is holy, you stop trying to escape it. There's also a kind of theatricality in how these structures are presented. Ceremonies held at dawn, where the rising light frames the crucified statues just right, incense thick enough to mask the stench of the slums beyond the gate. The music, oh Emperor, the music, written to echo in stone vaults so it drowns out the coughing and the screams. It's not worship, it's performance, faith is spectacle. And if a few million souls die just outside the walls while the choirs sing, all the more reason to sing louder. So yes, these places are rebuilt, maintained, protected, not for the people, but for the message, that no matter how far the rest of the city falls, there will always be a holy place left standing, a perfect, shining spine holding up a corpse of a world. And everyone else? They live beneath it, beneath the judgment, beneath the shadow, beneath the boots of saints carved in iron and stone. That's the hierarchy, that's the vision, that's the Imperium, a galaxy where the only thing more eternal than suffering is the cathedral built to justify it. There's something impossibly human, tragic and beautiful and horrifying all at once about the way ordinary people live in the wreckage of Imperial cities. We talk so much about the architecture, the ideology, the theocracy carved into every block of stone, but we don't often stop to think about the lives unfolding beneath all of that. Lives lived in the dark spaces between broken walls. Lives shaped by cracked floors and ceilings ready to fall. Lives where survival isn't just a necessity, it's a culture, a mindset, a legacy passed from parent to child, generation after generation, all under the same crumbling dome. The people who live in these ruins don't see them as ruins, not really. They're homes. They're familiar. You ask a hiver what they think of the collapsed tower in their sector, and they won't call it a disaster. They'll call it a landmark. They'll tell you which bricks are safe to climb, where to shelter during the acid rain, and how to tell when the ceiling's about to give. There's a kind of rough intimacy there, like how sailors love a ship that leaks and groans but still floats. These cities break, but they hold their people in their own brutal way, and that creates something unique, a form of cultural adaptation so deep it reshapes identity. Kids grow up not just learning how to read or pray, but how to listen for structural groans, how to find warmth in cold stone, how to dig through rubble for salvage. Families have heirlooms that are just bits of pipe or bone charms pulled from collapsed vaults. There are songs passed down about which tunnels still lead to working water and which ones house feral servitors. Folk wisdom, forged in ruin, but more than anything, what defines life under the rubble is endurance. Not in the soft, inspirational sense we're used to, but in the hard, ragged, blood-on-your-hands kind of way. People keep going because there's no other option. You work until your back gives out. You pray until your lips crack. You eat whatever doesn't kill you first. And still, you get up the next day and do it again. That's not desperation. That's normalcy in the Imperium. And they don't just endure, they find meaning in it. There's an entire language built around suffering. Phrases like, "The Emperor tests the strong," or "Bless the falling dust," become part of daily speech. When a section of a HAB unit collapses and kills a dozen people, the survivors gather for mass not to curse fate, but to thank the Emperor for sparing the rest. Children are told bedtime stories about saints who lived under worse conditions and smiled through it. Because if they could suffer with grace, so can you. I read once about a community that lived under a broken transit pylon for over 200 years. The top half of the pylon had crushed the HABs below, and instead of leaving, the locals rebuilt around it. Used the gaps in the metal as chimneys, planted fungal crops in the shadow of the wreckage, painted devotional murals on the underside of the crushed support beams. They called the pylon Our Lady of Weight and held services under it every week. A crushing catastrophe had become a saint. That's what I mean when I say people adapt. And they celebrate endurance. There are feast days not for victories, but for surviving particularly hard years. Whole festivals built around when a district went 5 winters without losing more than a quarter of its population. Pain becomes a point of pride. You didn't eat protein paste for a week? You're weak. You lost your leg in a floor collapse and kept working? Hero. The more you've endured, the more respected you are. And those who don't embrace the suffering, who ask for more light, more food, more safety, are seen as dangerous, not just ungrateful, heresy adjacent. It's this twisted social contract where no one expects comfort, and anyone who does is suspect. Why would you want more than your neighbor? Why would you question the Emperor's will? The ruins teach humility, and humility keeps you alive. And so the culture enforces it, not from above, but from within. People police themselves, keep each other in line, not with malice, but with a kind of desperate love. Because if one person starts asking questions, it could draw attention. And attention, in the Imperium, usually means fire. There's also this interesting phenomenon where the worse off a community is, the more religious it becomes. You'd think it would be the opposite, but it's not. In the brokenest places, where the light never comes on and the air stinks of blood and oil, that's where you'll find the loudest hymns, the most fervent processions. Faith becomes the structure that the city can no longer provide. The walls may fall, but the Emperor remains. Or so they hope. And somehow, through all of this, people still find joy. Real joy. Kids play games in cratered courtyards. Lovers sneak away into collapsed archives. Families gather around broken generators for warmth and laugh at old stories. There's laughter in the dark. There's art scratched into the walls. There are songs sung over bones. It's not a happy life, but it's still life. Still human. Still beating. That's the part that always gets me. Not the horror of it, though there's plenty of that, but the resilience. The way people keep pushing forward through a world that actively hates them. The way they find pride in simply existing another day. The Imperium doesn't give them much, but what it does give them is a story. A role. You are a loyal citizen if you suffer. If you endure. If you never complain. And if you die under rubble, then maybe your name will be remembered in a sermon one day. So they keep going, living in cities that should be abandoned, building lives out of scrap and superstition. Because what choice do they have? And because in a world as broken as the Imperium, surviving is the only kind of victory you're ever going to get. There's a moment of stillness you feel when standing in a city that no longer lives, not just a ruined one, not a struggling district with candles in the windows, but a place where the silence is total. No movement, no whispers, no breath. Just the weight of stone and dust, and the sense that something sacred, something horrible, happened here, and the city itself is holding its breath in reverence. Because in the Imperium, some cities don't fall. They die. And when they do, they become tombs. Not just for the bodies buried beneath them, but for memory, for myth, for faith. And what's wild is that the Imperium doesn't see these dead cities as failures. It sees them as achievements, as proof that loyalty endured until the very end, as relics in their own right. Cities like Helion Magna, where the entire population locked their gates during a planetary invasion and refused to surrender, not to Xenos, not to heretics, not even to starvation. For 10 years, no one left, no one survived. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found a city of neatly stacked bones, prayer scrolls still fluttering on the wind, and a message carved into the wall of the governor's palace. We did not break. That city is still there. No one lives in it. No one touches it. It's considered a shrine now. Pilgrims travel for months just to walk its empty streets, to breathe in the dust of the dead, to weep where the last choir sang. The administratum issued a decree declaring it a martyr zone, which means it can't be altered, used, or repurposed. Even scavenging is considered a form of desecration, and if you're caught doing it, well, best not to be caught. These cities become part of the Imperial mythscape. They're taught in sermons, written into ecclesiarchal poetry. The way saints once were flesh and blood, and now are icons and chants, cities follow the same path. A place that died properly, in silence and loyalty, becomes immortal. More immortal than those still struggling to function. It's almost enviable in a way, to become legend instead of dragging yourself through another generation of slow collapse. One of the most famous examples is Sanctified. Once a vibrant hive, it was hit by a viral bombardment during a conflict with chaos. The disease moved so fast that people died in their homes, at their workbenches, mid-prayer. But here's the part that gets me. The city didn't panic. The Vox network stayed active until the very end, broadcasting prayers, instructing people to stay indoors, to pray, to prepare. They didn't run. They waited. And when the virus finally burned itself out, the Adeptus Mechanicus sealed the city with ceramite plating and declared it preserved in sacred agony. To this day, it remains untouched, a hive of corpses, frozen in obedience. And it's not just about natural disasters or attacks. Some cities are sacrificed, deliberately, on orders from above. Exterminatus doesn't always come from panic. It comes from doctrine, from cold calculus. A single psychic outbreak, one whisper of heresy, and an entire city is reduced to radioactive ash. But afterward, even that ash becomes holy. People gather it in reliquaries, engrave the names of the fallen on plasteel plaques. Sometimes, if the blast crater is stable enough, the ecclesiarchy will build a shrine right in the middle, as if to say, here lie the faithful, and here stands proof of their loyalty. That's what always hits hardest, the way death is rebranded into devotion. It doesn't matter if the city starved, was bombed, or just crumbled into itself from centuries of neglect. If it died faithful, then it died well. And the more complete the annihilation, the purer the memory becomes. There are no survivors to complicate the story, no one to say, it wasn't holy, it was horror. Only silence. And from that silence, the Imperium writes scripture. There are fan theories that some of these tomb cities aren't just left alone. They're guarded. That deep beneath their ruins, catacombs still burn with sacred flame. That the Adepta Sororitas station relic wardens there, women who never speak, who simply watch. Not to protect the world from the dead, but to protect the memory of the dead from being contaminated. Because if a place was declared holy in its ruin, then any attempt to rebuild would be sacrilege. And sometimes the cities aren't completely dead. Sometimes people still live in the bones, refusing to accept that the city has been declared a shrine. Maybe it's a family that never left. Maybe it's scavengers turned permanent residents. But these people are ghosts in the eyes of the Imperium. Not citizens, not heretics either. Just forgotten threads. And yet, even they pray. Even they whisper thanks to the Emperor for the honor of surviving where others could not. Because the dead have become saints, and the living, if they keep their heads down, might someday join them. I once read an account from a rogue trader who stumbled into one of these places. No records of it in the archives, no mention in the stars. Just a city in the middle of a dead world, glowing faintly with phosphor light. The buildings were cracked but standing. The statues still wept incense. And at the center was a chapel filled with skeletons, each holding a book, each frozen mid-prayer. He didn't touch anything, just left an offering, made the sign of the Aquila, and walked back into the dark. Said it was the most peaceful he'd ever felt in the galaxy. These cities don't scare people, they humble them. They're reminders of the end, not as failure, but as fulfillment. A city that lives is under test. A city that falls is vindicated. And a city that dies with dignity? That's sacred. And maybe that's what the Imperium really wants in the end. Not cities that thrive, but cities that end well, that become mausoleums of meaning. Because in a universe where progress is heresy, The only noble thing left to do is collapse with grace and let the silence tell the rest of the story. So after all this, the spires and the scaffolds, the broken habs and the cathedrals built from ash, the cities that weep and the ones that sing as they die, what are we really left with? Not just a picture of urban decay, not even just a theology carved into brick and blood. We're left with something more chilling, the realization that this is not chaos. It's not the result of negligence or bad luck or the random entropy of a crumbling galactic empire. It is a system designed, perpetuated, preached. Imperial cities are not falling apart because they've been forgotten. They are meant to fall apart. They are temples to decay, palaces of pain, labyrinths of submission and slow ruin. They teach lessons. They extract loyalty. They burn hope down to cinders and call the ashes holy. And the people living in them, those billions pressed into collapsing walls and poisoned tunnels, they don't fight it. They adapt to it. They carry it forward. They build their lives around it and call it faith. Because in the Imperium, survival is a miracle. Endurance is obedience. And to live in a broken world without asking for more, that's how you prove you're worthy of the Emperor's light. There are no clean lines between worship and resignation anymore. The cities blur them all. You kneel because there's nowhere to stand. You sing hymns because silence would be too much to bear. You learn to love the rot because it's the only constant you've ever known. And somehow, in all of this, people still find purpose. That's the twisted brilliance of it. The Imperium doesn't need hope to function. It needs repetition, ritual, cracked stone, and bowed heads. And maybe, when we look at it from the outside, the scariest part isn't the sheer scale of the decay or the cruelty baked into every structure. Maybe the scariest part is how familiar it all feels, how easy it is to see echoes of it in the corners of our own world, how systems of power don't just let things fall apart, but use that collapse to control, to inspire false devotion, to bury questions under layers of holy suffering. We talk about the Imperium as satire, as warning, as fiction, but are we really so far removed? When a society teaches its people that pain is proof of virtue, when it glorifies endurance while withholding relief, when it builds monuments instead of homes and asks its citizens to worship their own misery, that's not sci-fi. That's not just Warhammer. That's something older, deeper, human. So maybe this is why Imperial cities resonate so much, why we keep coming back to them, why we write fan theories and build terrain pieces and obsess over every cracked wall and leaning spire. Because somewhere deep down, we recognize the pattern. We see the ritual in the ruin, and we wonder quietly what part of ourselves is reflected in the stone. If you've made it this far, thank you. This wasn't just a lore deep dive. It was a journey into the soul of the Imperium, into the bricks and bones of its theology, into the cold logic of a city built not for life, but for obedience. And if any part of you felt uneasy, if any moment in this exploration made you pause and think, this sounds a little too real, good. That means you're paying attention. Make sure to subscribe if you want to keep digging into the forgotten, the broken, the buried. There's so much more in the cracks of this universe. Things most people overlook, but that tell us everything. And maybe together, we'll keep finding meaning in the shadows. Maybe we'll keep asking questions the Imperium doesn't want answered. Because even in a city built to crumble, the act of looking closely is a kind of rebellion. So hit that subscribe button. Light a candle, and don't forget to look up next time you walk through your own city, not just to see if the ceiling's about to fall, but to wonder who built it that way.